All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us on this post-election day technical committee meeting. I just wanted today, I think what makes sense is now that we finished the first round of public webinars, and I know a couple of you, I think David, Tim, you were on the second one, weren't you? Yeah. Were able to attend those. And Crystal, were you able to sit in on the first one for at least some of it? Yeah. And David was there. So we appreciated that. So now that we've finished that, I sent out the first round of sort of somewhat quasi-organized public feedback that we've gotten with the comments. And I thought we could start going through and figuring out exactly, well, maybe not exactly, but to what extent we need to go back and reconsider some of the information that we'd already pulled together, and also what to do moving forward with the public feedback. We'll discuss the next steps for developing recommendations, and then we'll talk about additional outreach that we still need to do as we start putting some of this information together and creating some recommendations and some more substantive and specific I guess goals out of that information. So I know I sent it out really late yesterday afternoon. I don't know if anybody had a chance to look at it, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we can go through it a little step by step.
I was actually pretty impressed by the number of attendees and comments that we've gotten.
Yeah, and this doesn't include the feedback yet from the surveys either. So we will have more of that as well. So this is just kind of like the open-ended feedback that we've gotten.
Mm-hmm.
All right, is everybody seeing the Word document? Cool. All right, so regarding the vision statement, it was generally pretty positive. We did get a couple of comments back, including one of them from Tim Keller, who's on the steering committee, but was not able to make the steering committee meeting. So I think this merits a little bit of time to spend talking about this phrase about people experiencing a quiet and serene natural environment as being part of the vision statement. Now, when the, you know, and David, I don't think you were a part of the conversation at this point. I think this was when Elaine was still doing this work for Albemarle County. The discussion was kind of that the entire corridor wouldn't necessarily be quiet and serene, but that there would be quiet and serene little pockets where people could escape to and have an opportunity to, you know, I guess in imperfect terms, commune with nature and just have that kind of that natural experience of being immersed in nature. After getting some of that feedback, I don't know that that's clear with the vision statement. And I also want to talk a little bit about some of that feedback we got, that establishing a space that is quiet and serene may be counter to some of the other goals and recommendations that this plan is working to achieve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about quiet and serene urban environment? We'll just make it another word.
Well, you know, I think some of those, maybe it could be as simple as saying where people experience a natural environment, enjoy healthy outdoor activities and venues, find quiet and serene opportunities, and appreciate. Like, there's going to be ways that people who want to commune with nature in that corridor can probably find a space or a place to do that. But I agree with everything that we want to cram into this corridor. It's not all going to be quiet and serene.
Mm-hmm.
I did walk it yesterday from Free Bridge, and when you go around the bend to River Bend Park, it's actually quiet and serene.
Yeah. But you had to go find it.
Quiet and serene. Once you go around the bend and hear Free Bridge, it's not. So there are pockets. So yeah, I think that's a good approach, Crystal.
So experience a natural environment. I'm going to leave track changes on so we can just go back if we want to. Experience a natural environment, enjoy healthy outdoor activities and venues. What did you say?
I was suggesting find quiet and serene opportunities. Again, I'm just thinking at the moment.
Sure. We'll put something down and give people a chance to look at it.
Yeah, I think that addresses Tim's question, or at least it better defines quiet and serene.
Mhm.
Okay.
I think that works.
Okay.
Tim, job to make that quiet and serene place. Can you deal with that?
Well, I really appreciate this, this exchange because it is a tension, or just two complementary things, Even the way it's been written, it's like a vibrant place with a serene experience, or, it can't be both of those things. I wonder if the word dynamic is a better high level adjective, because sometimes it will be vibrant and sometimes it will be quiet and serene. And so it's the alternating sequence of experiences. I don't know how to capture that perfectly, but
You mean
it is true that there's going to be places that there's going to be just a din of traffic, or other places where it's not really like a negative sound. It's going to be, the clinking of glasses and people having beverages and drinks on a patio or something. So just a whole different sequence of experiences, I think, is what the future holds for that section of the river.
Mm-hmm.
So are you suggesting dynamic in the place of vibrant?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get away from the language that everybody has worked so hard on, but I do think dynamic is maybe it sets the stage for then having that more specific description later, even allowing for those descriptions to seemingly be at odds with one another. Vibrant economic activity and serene natural immersion, they don't have to be in contrast with one another if we kind of introduce it loosely enough, I guess.
Does anybody else have strong feelings of dynamic versus vibrant?
They both work for me. I see Tim's point. I have a strong feeling one way or the other.
Okay.
I don't have a strong feeling, but I think that, I like Crystal's suggestion, but I think you could also just remove the word quiet, maybe, and just have it be serene, because quiet is the real rub.
Sure. Any strong opinions on that one way versus the other?
I think that sounds pretty good.
Serene natural environment. So that's what it would read that way. A place where people experience a serene natural environment.
Actually, I don't think that I was thinking dropping the quiet as the phrase was moved to be another in the series versus bringing it back to a serene natural environment, because there's a natural environment throughout the corridor, but not all of it is serene. And I still think that, yeah. But I was thinking if Kim was suggesting dropping quiet and in this shifted phrase, does that accomplish what you're thinking?
Yeah. So find serene opportunities, in other words. Yeah, I think that works.
And everybody's definition of serene is different. They're not all quiet. Because, listening to a bunch of birds freaking out might be serene.
There were a lot of people who are very passionate about birds in this corridor.
That's cool.
Yeah, and in the way that Crystal has it phrased, with quiet and serene, because you could find them, so it's probably fine to just leave it that way too. Or
Okay.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know that needs to be belabored.
Okay.
But or maybe peaceful and serene.
Peaceful. I like peaceful. I think peaceful might be more of. I like peaceful. Any strong opinions on that?
No, I like peace.
We need more of it these days.
Yes, indeed.
So that was probably the most consistent feedback. We heard that from a couple of places, including from one of our steering committee members. The The other one is that in the Albemarle County Historic Preservation Committee, there was a comment about not really liking the word appreciate because it's not something you can force people to do. The suggestions were like be aware of or be informed about. Again, I don't have a strong opinion. It's just feedback that we got.
Yeah, I guess we can change it. It seems like a vision you would hope that people would appreciate the historic resources. So I don't have them. That word doesn't bother me.
Okay.
Myself, I'm okay trying to find something else, but I don't know. I think an aspiration would be to have people appreciate the historic resources.
Okay.
So, that's my sense on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with those sentiments, David. And just because it's been brought to our attention, responding to that comment or that feedback, if it said experience important historic and cultural points, maybe that's something that's less value laden and could capture not just physical access to experience it, but be educated about it and learn about, people that came before us. But the problem is experience is kind of the first, if you will, verb, I think it would be in this long clause. So I don't want, it's a jigsaw puzzle if you look at it too long, but if it said where people access a natural environment to enjoy healthy outdoor activities, to find the opportunities to experience the history, maybe accessing the riparian corridor is like the all-encompassing action. And then there's different words that, follow it. I don't know. That might be thinking too hard, but that's what's coming to mind right now.
Yeah. It's all a snowball, right? You change one thing, you have to go back and look at what else do we have to change as a result of it. In fact, that's probably why the word appreciate is there, because we already had experience. That's probably why we landed on that one initially. Well, we can just leave it for now. We can go back and maybe think about it a little bit more if anybody develops a strong feeling between now.
I think this is a vision statement, and I think if people are educated, aware, experience, interact, learn, then to David's point, the appreciation level might go up, and that's a vision. There are a lot of things that we don't have control over in this corridor.
Sure. Yeah, I guess to that point too, we can't make people enjoy outdoor spaces. We can't make people, be at peace in nature. I guess that's all.
The only other word I can think of would be, acknowledgement. If it's intended, if the question is that there's a different way to respect these points of interest.
Mm-hmm.
But again, we don't necessarily need to belabor it because,
yeah,
or maybe it frankly is something like, and respect these points of interest.
Yeah, that was actually my only alternative was maybe it's respect or something like that. But again, I'm okay with taking the input but leaving it appreciate.
Okay.
Yeah, Crystal, I tend to agree with your comment that if we're going to have a word like appreciate, which is kind of value laden, the vision statement is the place that it's most appropriate to do that. This is more of the aspirational and hopeful statement. It might be it might fit less well in the guiding principles or recommendations, but maybe it's okay in a vision statement.
So I'm going to kind of maybe push the issue now that I'm thinking about it, but like there may be a historic point of interest that had something to do with the Civil War. That doesn't mean you're going to appreciate it, or like some famous Confederate, somebody did something. I don't know that we want people to necessarily appreciate it, but maybe, I don't know. There may be historic and cultural things that are not positive through everybody's lens. And so maybe pushing the term appreciate is what's rubbing the wrong way.
That's a good comment to consider, I think, here.
I mean, there's acknowledge. I don't know, this is where sort of that equity, that question comes, like, who do you offend with a word associated with historic and cultural points of interest?
Mm-hmm.
I have a suggestion that if you, I don't know if this would be too much changing of it, but if you just took out all the other, if you just kept experience at the beginning where people experience, and then take out the other verbs like enjoy and find and appreciate, it could just be you're experiencing all of those things potentially.
And shortening the vision statement.
So what was that again? I was actually looking up the definition. Recognize the full worth of, understanding, fully recognize the full implications of, and it has synonyms that are acknowledge, recognize, realize, know, admire, treasure, cherish, prize, respect, value. My definition of appreciate isn't that you have to accept that it's the right thing historically, but understand the context of it. So, the Civil War issue would be one that you just acknowledge the history of. You judge it how you do, but you appreciate its historical context, good or bad. So, I don't know. I'm actually fine. This is not my strength. I'm more looking at the clock and making sure we get through the whole thing, and we're still in the last sentence of the vision.
Sure.
So I'm comfortable adjusting it to whatever we're all comfortable with. I don't have a problem with changing it.
Okay.
But I'm not sure I'm the best one to put a word on what that change is.
All right. Why don't we do this? So there are a couple of options I think that we're landing on. So one of them, I would say that the two options we're kind of talking about right now, right, is taking all the other verbs out and just leaving it at that. And then the other option would be to leave it as it was with the original word. So why don't we put together a poll for the technical advisory committee and just see where everybody lands on it? Does that sound good? And if it's really split, we can discuss this more at the next meeting.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, we can do that for the sake of getting through everything. I don't think anything is going to. The other comment we had was this was from Christine Putnam, I think, about potentially including the word ecological along with historic and cultural points of interest. I don't personally feel that needs to be included because we're talking about sort of the environmental protection and detail other places, but I don't have a strong opinion if you all feel like this should be added.
I don't think it needs to be added.
All right. So as far as a lot of these are, Andrea said that her audio quit working, so we'll see if she is able to come back or not. A lot of the comments I think are going to be more in terms of using these to shape recommendations versus actually going back and tweaking some of the guiding principles. We did get a couple comments that were in line about sort of establishing that the environmental protection is not just about how to protect the river from when people are using it, but also communicating that the community has a responsibility to steward and protect the river resources itself. So, and this actually came up in a couple of different places, but the word, one suggestion was to add environmental protection and the word and stewardship to the guiding principle. So I don't know if you guys have strong opinions one way or the other, whether or not we should put that into the guiding principle itself, or maybe that just is the basis of developing a recommendation around that.
I think that's a important comment. I think it's actually both, you know, like it could be something that we flesh out further in a, you know, recommendation, but to me, protection seems a little too static, like you just lock it away and don't touch it kind of a thing, like preservation. Whereas really this really as an urban riparian corridor requires active management and maybe things like rehabilitation and restoration of certain landscapes and habitat. So I really think stewardship is more of like a active ongoing verb that, you know, just by including that word, it sets up a lot of different other important content.
Okay.
Yeah,
And it may address some of those other comments.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think it's a good thing to add, and I don't want to belabor this, but Wayne might remember we used to have a big discussion about how we use protection and preservation and conservation and protection, and this is a corridor that we're utilizing. It's a conservation effort, not just a protection effort. So I think the stewardship helps to kind of define that better.
Yeah.
I like that.
We used to have discussions about a lot of words.
Yes,
Very
that's
familiar to me so far in terms of getting the right words in there. So yeah, but I agree, David. And Tim, you made a good point, I think. I was here more to listen than to try to add more words. I think David had enough of my red pen over the many years that when I retired, I promised him I wouldn't do that to him again.
Oh.
yeah.
Well, it's better to get the feedback up front than, you know,
Mhm.
later
Very-
in the process. I'd rather have lots of red on it now, so there's less red down there.
True.
It's all good.
I think most of the rest of these are things that we could think about as we develop recommendations. And what I might suggest is that for the staff people that are involved in some of these, maybe we schedule more focused meetings on developing these into sort of actionable recommendations to bring forth to the committee as a whole to talk through a little bit more. Some of these, like there's a lot of concerns about invasive species, for example. So I know we're going to have to come up with some, you know, recommendations for how to address invasive species. That's something that, I don't know, I probably got at least 6 or 7 emails about invasive species. So that was definitely a theme. I don't know exactly what the options are. I think probably having a conversation with the parks folks and the environmental folks would be a more fruitful conversation than maybe all of us in this committee, you know, trying to parse that out. That would be my suggestion, to go through this more detailed feedback. Does that sound good with you all?
Yeah, I agree. And one of the ones that Kat mentioned, the stormwater management's the one that's sort of been in the back of my head. We need to kind of think about too, how we address that in this corridor.
Okay.
And there may be some other colleagues that we want to bring into that conversation.
Right.
Right.
And those are really more technical questions that we got to get to the recommendation stage. Or are we recommending very specific things, or recommending further study? You know, what do we have time to do in the remaining months that we have to work on this? So yeah, I agree with you completely. That's a
Okay.
staff meeting we need to do.
And it might be, you know, a large portion of the same committee, but I think probably having time that's set aside for more specific conversations versus more general plan review probably makes sense at that level. And then we can come back and I'll talk about it together. So we got a lot of comments about the environmental protection and stewardship. That was really a huge concern from a lot of people. I think one of the things we're also going to have to grapple with, and I think I mentioned this when I got in touch with your economic development department, David, is that the public feedback is kind of like not really super excited about a lot of development along the river. And we know that it's not an option to move all of the industrial sites. We know that there has to be some opportunities for, new development along the river. Like I like from a pragmatic, what's reasonable, what's feasible within this plan. We know that we're not going to just not allow any additional, economic development. So I think we do probably need to have some really targeted conversations with maybe some developers, maybe it's the economic development staff, just to talk about what feels reasonable to at least speak to that desire from the public, to make sure that the environmental beauty and integrity of the area is maintained, but to still be able to allow development at some scale to be permitted in the area.
Yeah, I think some of the public comment we hear is a little bit of confusion about whether, certainly I think a lot of people are sophisticated enough to know that their comments are about adjacent lands, but I do wonder whether they're more worried about intrusion into the stream valley, not knowing the technical limitations and already regulatory limitations to doing that. So I think some of the public comment is more of, don't let stuff creep into the corridor that is already limited by floodplain regulations and steep slope regulations and things like that. But so, it is an issue we have to address. And I think one of the expectations of this plan is that we have a little bit more specificity in this corridor plan that gives good guidance in a small area plan way to those adjacent developers. That's what we're looking for. And I think the primary area in this corridor we have to focus in on is the shopping center. Once you get sort of around and past the shopping center in the county, the topography really limits what's going to happen in this corridor. But we do have to kind of focus in on that shopping center area and the remaining areas north of 250.
Well, and this might be an opportunity to communicate with the public, to reassure the public that the topography itself is going to not allow a lot of what you're afraid of could potentially happen on the river.
Well, what I did notice in some of the comments I saw was actually a fair number of comments about the city and River Road. So I think, perhaps the city has to approach things, on their side. There actually may be more questions and concerns there about how things get redeveloped or cleaned up.
Right.
For our side of things, I reckon maybe Wayne and Roger have talked about this, but I think the shopping center is important to lay out some expectations both for the community and the developer as to, what level of engagement we have there. But the rest of the corridor in the county is pretty much already limited by its physical constraints.
David, the shopping center hasn't come up in conversations I've had in EDO discussions regarding different items on their plate, but I had remembered that there was going to be a meeting with the owner of the shopping center, and JT maybe was going to be part of that meeting. I don't know if that's happened yet or not, but.
Yes, we had that meeting last week. Their primary interest, they want to turn towards the river too. And they're thinking mostly residential. And so the thing that first thing comes to mind to me is the impact is not so much into the corridor as it exists right now. The floodplain regulations and steep slopes will address that. But what's the visibility of, are the buildings going to be 2, 3, or 5 stories? And is that verticality and the vistas from the river up, is that something that we're going to protect? Because even if we keep the most of the buffered area there, what's our expectations for visibility from that corridor and then to the river? And I think we need to address those sorts of things. Where do we allow for some interaction, and where do we provide for some protections? of visibility as an example.
I haven't focused on the updated, latest revised and adopted Pantops plan and what it might say about that near the river corridor, but there might be something there. I'm not sure. But it seems like this is an opportunity through this process to supplement that, what might be there in the Pantops plan.
Yeah, the Pantops plan would allow 4 stories up to 5 by exception. So the exception notion is the, you know, what further defines what our expectations are adjacent to the corridor. So maybe it's 3 stories, step back to 5 some distance away based on visibility. And right now the comp plan or the master plan doesn't provide that next level of how do we engage adjacent to this corridor.
I think it's an opportunity here to fine tune some of that. And if there's something about uses as well that needs to be fine tuned, this is an opportunity in this process to do that. So they work together, but one kind of further defines the other.
Right. So when we get that rezoning, we not only have the recommendations for that comp plan designation, but we also have the further finer grained recommendations about what to do adjacent to this corridor.
And by the way, make sure you're checking with Monticello as well.
That's right.
I do remember that from before I left. So
We're kind of, since we're talking about the economic development, we'll get to that section. I'll go through that section when we get there. But I did get a email from Brian Roy from the Woolen Mills LLC, who just said, like, hey, you know, couldn't make the webinars, like to be engaged, let us know. I thought it might be helpful to have a conversation with him because at least based on what I know about the development, I think that is a good example of a commercial development that is trying to sort of have a relationship and foster engagement with the river and that kind of thing. So I think it might be helpful just to see, like, hey, what would be helpful for us to know about, like, what made that a successful opportunity for you, and how, you know, what would help support that for other projects. So.
And I think some folks may remember he did a presentation. I think it was the first Rivanna Renaissance Conference. So he's certainly been, you know, the river and his development have been connected.
Yeah.
Actually, am going to meet with Brian on Friday morning, so I can talk to him a little bit about what you've mentioned, Sandy, and we want to kind of find out more about what he has a particular interest in and connecting to the river. Obviously, he's got a bridge that hopefully is going to be open before too long. And he has indicated, I understand, that he's willing to let the island become part of what might be more of a public place, if you will, or space. Maybe a better word to use is public space, which is, you know, another possibility in thinking about how the corridor is being utilized more for, you know, very passive recreation purposes than anything else.
Sure, yeah. No, that'd be great. I mean, I think that's a really great example of where we can learn from somebody who's already doing it and knowing how we can support that. Yeah, that'd be great if you want to report back.
I can get back to you once we've talked to him.
We also got a very specific comment in the webinar that somebody would like to see a microbrewery that's accessible off of the trail system. So it sounds like that might be coming pretty soon.
Yeah.
All for that.
Well, he'll probably volunteer the microbrewery in his space.
Yeah. Well, I read an article that said that was one of the plans. So hopefully, fingers crossed.
They're pouring beers as we speak.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. I've been there.
It's pretty cool. It's amazing, actually. But Sandy, before we pivot fully to economic development, I was just kind of tracking along with what David and Wayne were discussing about the shopping center and everything. It makes me think of one of the comments from the Thursday meeting on the 29th. I think, you know, speaking of Monticello, I think it was Liz Russell, but she kind of floated the concept of, when we think about future development and redevelopment and think about the experience of being on the river or on the trails, can we actually think of the river as like an entrance corridor, something along those lines? And, you know, I don't know about the land use regulation dimension of that sort of notion, but that section of the Rivanna is a state designated scenic river. So I don't think that kind of creates any land use controls or requirements or regulations, but it's at least a relevant reference point, you know, and maybe they've got criteria that we could draw upon as we do this.
Well, Tim, what I'm fearful of too, and I think we have DEQ on our stakeholders list. I guess it would be DEQ or DCR. I think DCR. But if we do development where we lose that designation, it's might not go over very well. We worked hard to get it.
Yeah.
So I do think we have to be cognizant of that designation. And if we want to maintain it, we need to know how far we can go before we jeopardize it.
Well, maybe that's a great point. And maybe we could use that as a recommendation in here, you know, that new development or redevelopment proposals are evaluated specifically for their, you know, potential impacts to that designation, or maybe draw in some of the language from that scenic river program, you know, enabling legislation, or if there's any other criteria that they list.
Right.
It just seems like something we should explicitly connect those dots. And
well, there is criteria about intrusion and visibility of adjacent development, and in fact, number of bridges that cross the river is also a criteria. So when the county adopted their resolution supporting the scenic river designation, they actually put a caveat to their support of it, in that they recognize that we wanted to do a pedestrian bridge crossing. So they endorsed the scenic river designation with some statement, I'd have to look it up, that said with the understanding that we need pedestrian crossings across the river. So that their action was clear that there was an intention to do a little bit more. I think it might be worth kind of getting that background again.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know too, because I know that we've received at least one comment related to the feasibility studies that we're working on, asking about if the visual impacts had been considered. And I think the answer is like, yes, they have been considered, but we need to make sure if there are any constraints on those specific to that scenic river designation, that those are also accounted for.
And this last comment, I'll shut up after this, but it might just barely be more than conjecture. But, you know, I think the difference is always in the details. And so a bridge is not a natural feature, but when I look at those old railroad trestles with the cut stone and, you know, how it soars over the river valley and at Moore's Creek, like, to me, those things actually contribute to the scenery of a river and is part of what I understand an urban river to be. You know, the railroad bridges, or maybe in the 21st century, we have aesthetically beautiful bike ped bridges, you know, wouldn't that be nice? So I get that not everybody would agree with that. And that's really a nuanced take on it. But yeah, scenery, maybe we could just try to think about using language that allows for more than just nature to be a part of that scenery as we do this local planning exercise. You know, a little bit different than the state scenic program, but.
Yeah, we had an interesting conversation with Jenny Keller yesterday, and Nick, you might have to help me remember exactly what she said, but her point was like these historic and cultural resources that we're talking about actually could be considered like in the same category as natural resources. So I think that's a really good point to make, is that, and that point was made as well. I think it was in the Historic Preservation Committee meeting that we were at, David, that, you know, we're talking about doing buffering and landscaping and protecting the view from the river. We want to do that, but you want to be careful what you're buffering the views from, right? Like, you don't want to create buffers between like these nice, beautiful, historically or, you know, cultural assets. You want to protect the views from people who are using the river to things that are like industrial sites that don't have, you know, some sort of historical or intrinsic value. So I thought that was a really good point to think through as well as we develop recommendations.
Yeah, that's right.
Sandy, I just wanted to be reminded, do we have DGIF on our list of stakeholders? And this conversation reminds me of it because the city has partnered with them for a number of projects on Moores Creek to remove man-made obstructions in the stream. And so,
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't
You know-
think we do.
I did email somebody from the Game and Inland Fisheries, but it was like a very general email address. So if you have a
Yeah.
specific contact, I'd be happy to.
yeah, Louise Finger is the person that we've worked with most consistently, and she knows the river system in our area.
Okay. I jotted her name down, so I'll see if I can.
Yeah, if you need her contact information, let me know.
Great. We kind of jumped around a little bit. I think that was a really good conversation. It probably feeds into some other things, but just to sort of get back and make sure that I'm not skipping over anything important. We did get a couple comments about the recreational activities that I thought was really interesting. One of the comment was about being cautious not to sort of overdevelop or overprogram the recreational use of the corridor. And then somebody else said that they had disagreed with that guiding principle when we did the poll because it didn't have any boundaries associated with it. So I don't know if there's a simple way to add some sort of constraints to it, but I do really appreciate the point that, you know, I think some of this might be in response to the level of use that was occurring this summer, you know, was especially high due to the pandemic and being a little bit more limited as to what indoor opportunities were available. So everybody's looking for outdoor opportunities, but I think that's a good point to at least put on everybody's radar.
Well,
Yeah.
if the steering committee advocated to have environmental protection and stewardship be this overarching principle, then it needs to kind of be the, I don't know, like the litmus test that
Mhm.
activities in these other areas get evaluated against. And so hopefully that would provide some limitations on amount or extent or scope.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's where I was going. You have to look at these in kind of unison, and that one is sort of implies that we're encouraging and promoting, but along with the stewardship that we just added and that overarching guiding principle sort of governs how much we encourage and how much we promote.
But I think it's a real concern, not just here, but most natural areas that are accessible have
Mhm.
seen just really kind of unprecedented
Yeah.
pressure. And it's not been great for the environmental system.
Yeah. One of the things that might be helpful is that regardless of what other meetings we have to iron out some more of the technical details, it might be helpful to include the environmental folks if you have the capacity to do that, Crystal and Kim, just to, I don't know, make sure that if we're saying that that's our overarching concern first and foremost, that we're actually making sure that it's a consideration with these other.
Well, even though we should be doing that, I guess
Yeah.
maybe promoted worries people a little bit. Promotion can be a word that worries people. You know, you could say encourage and promote it within the context of good stewardship.
Okay.
And you know, you could qualify it here if you needed to. I'm a little hesitant to add a bunch of words.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's one approach, is just to recognize that we're encouraging and promoting within the context of a management approach is going to protect the natural environment to the extent it can. And I'm not proposing that. I'm just sort of saying that if we get to the point where
Okay.
people agree, I think that's the way you could probably handle it.
Yeah, you could add the phrase with environmental sensitivity or something.
Yeah, exactly. So just something that qualifies to promoting a little bit.
But not too much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you
Yeah.
just can't be too redundant, you know, or these things just get so long, people will read them.
Yeah. It should be succinct and, you know, easy to follow and not too many qualifiers. Yeah, and a lot of the recreational activities, I think we're doing some mapping work. I think Jessica's on this call. Tim, you might be able to speak to it a little bit more, but there's some coordination with mapping activities for trail systems and accessibility. So I think some of that will probably be integrated into this plan to identify, you know, where there are priorities for connections to be made. One thing that I think from an equity lens that we probably need to have a conversation about is access to the trails. Like where are people going to be able to get onto a trail system to access the parks? Are there underserved communities that we need to be kind of like mindful of that don't currently have access, that we should consider? That kind of thing, I think, are some of the conversations that would probably be appropriate for this plan. Anything else on recreational activities before we move on? Some of this was really straightforward. There are some concerns about dogs that have come up, and also related to public safety, this came up. I don't know what the rules are for allowing people to shoot guns in the county or the city for that matter, but I guess I don't know if people are actually shooting guns close to the corridor or if it just, you know, echoes because it's on water, but that has come up a couple times too.
Really? Huh.
Well, I'll just say from experience, you're allowed, not my own personal experience, you're allowed to carry and, you know, bear arms on county park property or under county park control and management, but you cannot discharge those firearms.
Okay.
That's a clear regulation.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't take long. It's not in this corridor, but adjacent to it, you get into rural areas in the county where you shoot. So you could be at the northern and southern edge of this development. You could hear the echoes of people shooting.
Yeah.
Because you can do that in our designated rural areas north of Dardentown Park and east of the I-64.
Yeah, I have a feeling because it's near water, sometimes things sound closer than they are when they're happening. But landscaping and buffering was pretty straightforward. I think we've talked about most of that. There were a couple of points that I thought were kind of interesting. Making sure that landscaping is done sort of in an ecologically sensitive way using native plants came up a couple of times. Mowing, I don't know if this is on here. This might have been under the environmental stewardship, but there were a couple of people who mentioned returning back to sort of natural native species or natural kind of more wild meadows and reducing the mowing in the parks. So new development, redevelopment, we've already talked about that a little bit. I mean, I don't know that we need to get into more detail at this time, but if anybody has anything else they want to add to this section.
Well, I don't think it's for us to discuss. I think maybe Crystal was copied on some emails I had with Missy. I do think we need to think about how this is going to get presented to our planning commissions, since there are going to be land use implications to it. And at this point in time, the only planning commission involvement is on the steering committee. And that might be fine, but I'm fearful that once it gets to the planning commission stage, they'll engage in these land use components, and we need to be thinking about how we vet those and whether we vet them jointly or not. But just to kind of put that out there so others here on the technical team know, it's at least an issue I'm trying to figure out from our side of things. Our planning commission, I feel like they're going to want to have a pretty strong hand in that comes out of this thing in terms of what we're proposing in the adjacent lands.
Well, and I think part of that, I guess, is that, you know, as I understood the discussions with Missy, the draft plan or the final draft plan would be presented to a joint meeting, public hearing, planning commission and city council for an ultimate, you know, adoption into the current comp plan, and then it would carry forward with the new comp plan. And that there's anticipated some need for, you know, what is the other outreach that happens between what's being collected at this point for this part of the process, and then once there is a draft plan, is there another phase of outreach that will kind of ensure that when it then gets presented, that's not when it's starting an outreach need.
Yeah.
That reaching out, you know, whether that's, maybe there are some workshops that can be set up to invite members of those elected bodies or appointed bodies to come in. I don't know.
Yeah, well, we need to think to it, and I don't want to get us sidetracked here. We got other things to get through, but whether it's useful or not, I just wanted to make sure everyone else on the technical team knew that's something we're kind of thinking through. How do we engage with the commissions on this? Because my hope is, I think the expectation is we have a unified plan that's agreeable on both sides as to what that plan is. At a very basic level, I do get a little concerned that our commission might wonder what the city's commission's thinking about across the river and vice versa, and making sure that whether they're still in two different localities subject to actions and control of those separate groups, that there is some common understanding and theme and acceptance of the plan that's moving forward. So.
Well, I wonder, when is the next steering committee contemplated to convene? Because maybe it's something that needs to be very directly presented to them, because frankly, they're on the steering committee in order to help coordinate with their respective bodies. And if we say, this is, you know, this is a path we expect this document to go on, help us know how to make that journey down that path as smooth as possible, or where are the key sort of go, no go kind of points in that path that we need to be aware of before we hit them.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, is to ask them how they want us to proceed on this. I think this is probably the next step.
We'll talk about this a little bit more. I'm thinking the next steering committee meeting would probably be in mid-December, before the draft is sort of more or less put into like its final format for the public to review. But we have recommendations, you know, developed for them to look over. That's what I was kind of thinking. We can talk more about that at our next meeting, though, if you all would like to. And then I think it's also a really important discussion, though, for these historic places and cultural features. You know, especially as we talk about equity, I think this is probably a really important area that we do a good job of being as broad in defining what qualifies as being of historic and cultural importance as possible. There's been a lot of engagement from people who care. Liz Russell and Ed Lay from Albemarle both reached out. Jenny Keller has reached out from Charlottesville to, you know, provide insight and be involved in the development of this. But I think we also really need to get some involvement from, you know, some of these I guess, like I don't want to say like historic populations, but people that have, you know, heritage that goes back several generations, and even through pre-colonial times. We really need to get some feedback on them for how to do this in a meaningful way that is respectful of their cultures and priorities. I think this one is going to be a little bit more of a challenge to get the right level of detail as well, because a lot of the feedback we're getting is from people who are very passionate and very knowledgeable about the local history, and the information we're getting is really granular. So I think we really need to think through, like, how can we utilize that information and create something meaningful, but at the right scale to make it, you know, useful and not completely overwhelming to put together for this plan. I think, you know, if somebody wanted to study the local history, that could be a project in and of itself, you know, to develop a plan on how to communicate that. So I think that's gonna
Yeah,
be a little bit
our
more.
historic preservation committee and the staff are putting together some listing of the resources that, you know, at this point in time, to me, the most important thing is to make sure that we don't have conflicting recommendations that might jeopardize those resources.
Mm-hmm.
We do with them and the specificity of them, that might actually be a future step, but at least knowing where they are and knowing that we don't have recommendations that jeopardize them seems to be the most important thing.
Sure.
Then we can figure out, you know, maybe some of the recommendations is to further engage in how we, you know, we don't have to answer everything in this plan.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a next step for our localities for implementation. But
Yeah. But the good news is that people are excited and engaged, and I think there can be some momentum moving forward to, you know, keep that going as long as we do it in a way.
Hey, team,
Okay.
I've got to excuse myself. I've got a 1 o'clock meeting.
All right.
Others,
Thanks,
but
Tim.
yeah, thanks a lot. Appreciate the discussion and all the hard work. I'll catch you all later.
Bye. Yeah, we're pretty close to wrapping up. I think the biggest thing with the trails, again, there's some opportunities where there's conflict between using the trails between like biking and hiking, and the paths aren't wide enough. So I think this is just going to probably be a more fruitful conversation if we talk to the Parks and Rec trails people to, you know, figure out what is reasonable to include as far as recommendations. I don't know that there's anything we really need to belabor at this point.
no, but I think, you know, that something like this plan is I know way back when, years ago, I think Parks and Rec, city and county Parks and Rec sort of had, whether it was an agreed to concept, an understanding of one side of the river might provide more of a type of facility than the other.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the topography on the county side, it's more realistic for there to be a little bit more primitive trails of it and some more environmentally sensitive, and just recognizing that kind of dynamic kind of helps a little bit, and having the plan articulate that.
Mhm.
I think what's important on the county side is south of the river by the shopping center down to the apartments. Is that really a preservation protection area, or is that something that is more like the area north of 250, you know, because of the concerns that were raised by the shopping center and some acknowledgement by even the community comments that maybe that's where there's a little bit more intensive development, and that's where the comp plan shows it. Is that little stretch till you get to around the bend, and on the city side, literally across the street, that's the real urban part of this stretch, and
Right.
probably need to be more overt about what intrusions, if you will, I use that word, wouldn't use that in the plan, but for us, that's where there's going to be perhaps a little bit more change, and this plan needs to kind of ferret that out a bit more. And that is a next step, though. We're not going to do that here at this moment, but we need to start laying that stuff out in this plan here. We only got a couple months to do it.
Yeah. Would you say that summarize it, David? Like specify where are the opportunities for more like intensive types of facilities? Does that summarize that?
And kind of the typology of the trail. I mean, we've got in our plan sort of the green street concept north of 250. So there's actually a cross section that shows it. And we might need to have a little bit of something like that in the areas where we expect a little bit more change.
Yeah.
When I walked in and I looked at all the invasive species around that shopping center, once you cleared it out, it's going to be pretty visible. So,
yeah.
Because there's a lot of crap down there.
Yeah.
So anyway, again, not to belabor the point, but yeah, I think that kind of captures it.
Okay.
And when you say facilities, you specifically mean trail?
Yeah, right. You know, there's manholes, you know, and stuff. I mean, there's some detail I don't know we need to get into, but yeah, mostly it's the trails and the cross section, and you know, how do we take care of the issue of the trespassing that goes on, and yet the visual protection of some of the more intrusive areas, those things.
Yeah, and some of the discussions we had in, and I think Andrea actually dropped off, but when we did the stream restoration work along Meadow Creek, there was also a big sewer line project that happened right in advance of that, and really just exploring the opportunities for the more intensive pedestrian path to follow that utility easement, because that's where there's limitations, if not restrictions, on vegetation anyway.
Yeah.
And if you had to dig it up to fix the main, it's not a big deal to go in and repave that section of a trail and then have your other areas. So again, I haven't looked at where the utility network is in our corridor, but it could inform some of the trail considerations.
Mhm.
Okay. Get that. Okay.
And
Anything-
and Rivanna's been amenable to that, at least in the project in the Meadow Creek Valley corridor.
No, that's a really great opportunity that we need to make sure is at least presented, if not, planned specifically at this point. Anything else related to the trail systems that you want to make sure are captured kind of in the notes for us to be aware of? The last one was public safety. There weren't a whole lot. I mentioned the guns, I mentioned the dogs. There were a couple of comments. I thought this was interesting. There were a couple of comments, kind of competing comments about the homeless camps and communities. I feel like homelessness in the region is a bigger issue than just in this area. But one of the comments was, well, if you're going to relocate them, where are you going to locate them to? And that's not solving the issue if you just move them somewhere else. So I don't think there's anything too surprising. One thing I will mention, I think I put it in the environmental section as well, but one of the recommendations was about having lighting on the trails or along the trails. Was also compliance with dark sky guidelines and balancing that out with sort of concerns about light pollution.
Yeah, and I think if I go back and remember why this public safety piece was in there, I don't think we were thinking about guns and unleashed dogs necessarily. It was more about how do you provide safety and response, what is it called? Effective response to persons who might get injured as they find their serene place or have a boating accident or break their leg on the trail. Whether it's markers, whether it's signage, I think that was that's part of what was informing this. It's interesting that the responses to it took a different direction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think you're right, Crystal. If you I don't have the recommendations on here, but I'm pretty sure the recommendations were about sort of like access in case of emergencies and things like that. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, and animal control, I recognize that there's a perception of an issue, but that I think both the city and the county have leash laws that boils down to enforcement.
Yeah.
What we're doing in the county is the discussion of additional dog parks, one in the immediate area. So maybe I'd defer to Tim, but maybe there's something that we acknowledge that are future adjacent facilities that might provide opportunities. But some of the things that were brought up are really just about enforcement, and I'm not sure how we approach them in this plan otherwise.
Well, maybe it requires a conversation with our public safety partners to say, this is coming up in this particular corridor. If we anticipate changes in use and activities, what is their input? I mean, that's their area of expertise, and perhaps we need to bring them into a meeting just on that.
Yeah, exactly. Because what they might say is surveillance, just having someone on the street, if you will, and that might lead to ranger type recommendations or ambassador type things. I guess that could be down the road, but you're right. That's their expertise. That's not ours. You probably need to get their advice on that.
We did have some general comments. one of them, when we talked to Siri with the Albemarle County office, one thing that we're just going to be mindful of is incorporating recommendations that will foster considerations for equity throughout the plan. So that's one thing we're going to try to keep a lens on. And I know that we're going to need a lot of help because nobody can do that well by themselves. There were a lot of comments about preferences. There's a lot of concern about parking when we talk about additional access. So if there are any recommendations for additional parking, we'll need to be very aware that that's going to get a lot of public feedback. Some of the suggestions were really, really specific. Some of these were kind of, kind of those sort of crazy, kind of out there, maybe not really feasible, but interesting ideas. I'm not sure where this pumping station is, the former pumping station. That's been referenced a few times. Do you all know what they're talking about when they?
Yeah,
I think it's at the south end of Riverview Park.
Okay.
yeah, I think that's the one they're talking about,
Okay.
which got replaced.
Right. There was a big upgrade project maybe 5 years ago,
Yeah.
something like that.
Okay.
Which basically put it way down in the ground so that it addressed the odor issue. I think sort of the result, if I recall.
Okay. Well, the property owners in that area that worked very hard to get that situation resolved are very concerned because on the maps it shows that there's enhanced river access in that general area, and so they're very concerned that that's going to be something that generates a lot of traffic or some sort of nuisance for them.
Well, and they're already dealing with all the traffic in Riverview Park and probably any idea of more in that very tight, small, old neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
Does that parking get filled up? Yeah,
Oh,
so
yeah.
I thought I saw a couple comments about parking on the street related to the,
Oh, yeah. I mean, even pre-COVID, it's a place that the running community really goes to a lot. I mean, I know a lot of the high school, running teams and stuff practice there because it's beautiful.
yeah.
Yeah.
Once the real connection can be made out of Woolen Mills, there's the parking there that would give an opportunity for people to park in that location, not have to come down Market and park at Riverview Park.
Yeah.
So there is that potential to relieve the Riverview Park in the future, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I bet you there's a fair amount of county folks that probably drive over there too, that if this bridge ever gets constructed, you might get parking on the other side.
Yeah, over on the Pantop side, David.
Yeah. There should be plenty of parking at State Farm at some point in time. But I'm not sure whether we have a count for who's parking in there, but I would suspect there's a fair amount.
Yeah, I do think probably this plan will need to adjust parking at some extent, especially if we're talking about a new pedestrian bridge too. I don't think necessarily the intent is that people would drive to a new bridge in order to access the bridge specifically, but it is a concern whenever there's a new sort of facility that this seems to be concerns about parking seem to be coming up pretty consistently. So
well, access points, fair, equitable, and more frequent access points is clearly something we need to address and provide. And I think some level of parking has to be associated with at least some of those.
Yeah.
That's another way is to kind of diffuse it, just like the interconnected street system. The more accesses that have 3 or 4 or 5 spaces available,
yeah,
you can address that demand, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think that might be, a facility. I'd like to see a small walk-up amphitheater. But I think that addresses sort of most of the themes of the questions. So I think what we might do is the TJPDC folks will start setting up maybe some smaller meetings to develop these out a little bit more. We might take a stab at putting some general suggestions for recommendations together and then scheduling some smaller meetings to start working through these, and then hopefully by our next meeting, we probably won't have all of them done, but we'll have at least some of these sections at least sort of outlined to start going over a little bit more detail.
Yeah, I think Sandy, in parallel, I'm going to try to talk with Tim a little bit, and Kim, maybe we need to be thinking a little bit about what we as the county would like to add, what we want in the plan a little bit more, so that, you know, we can kind of come together with sort of these changes from recommendations. And I'm thinking a little bit more about the map and what we show on the map and stuff.
Sure.
So we'll start to work on that a little bit too.
Great.
Hey, David, you had a few county people that met, what, a month ago, I guess, to just talk about how we were making contact with some of the interests. Were you thinking about having a follow-up of that group? And we'll have talked to a few folks in the Broadway corridor.
Yeah. Tim is,
Go
sorry. Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that could be an opportunity to kind of go over some of what you were mentioning.
Yeah, I thought we'd do kind of a post-mortem of those meetings and what we heard coming out of it. Tim and Parks and Rec are a little bit behind in their contacts, and they're actually making them this week.
Yeah. Okay.
Next week we can get together, talk about what we heard, and we can talk about some of the specificity that we might want to see in the plan, and kind of working on that.
Any other, I don't see anybody else from the public still on, but anybody else have any, Jessica, do you want to give a brief update on the webinar on the 12th? Since you sat in this whole time.
Sure. No, the webinar is still planning to go forward on the 12th from 6 to 7 p.m. I know that I promised both city and county folks that I would have the slides done ahead of time. I'm hoping to have those done by the end of business on Thursday, tomorrow. So I'll share those on Friday. David, I just CC'd you on a draft of the press release. So looking for feedback on that, and then help sending that out if you guys have like a public information officer or something like that, or if you're that person. So.
I forwarded it on to our Cape group, Emily and Serena. Hopefully they're a little more expert than I am, but that's my lunchtime reading. I'm going to look at it here.
I tried to keep it super short so people would actually read it and the message would get out. So that's the plan.
Yeah, I think, Sandy, you had mentioned putting together a poll for the technical committee, because in fact, you know, we have a really small group here today.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that poll could maybe go beyond the vision statement modifications that we made and kind of speak to some of the points under each of those categories.
Okay.
I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I feel like we have a little bit of a limited set of participants responding to a lot of public comment that is all over the place, and just trying to figure out how do we, besides these smaller meetings, which I think we'll get at digging into a lot of this, how do we get the rest of the technical committee to provide some input into how those small meeting discussions could go? I mean, I'm thinking like Chris Gensick or Dan. I mean, those folks have a lot of also, you know, like they know that area like the back of their hand, and I don't want to move. I don't want to plow forward because we're on a timeline, and, you know, having Missy and Nick, Joey and those folks, like, I'm just a little bit nervous that our timeline now is going to push us to to blow past some stuff.
Yeah, and regarding the timeline too, I guess I keep saying it because I'm just trying to stay on the course that superiors we're going to stay on, but we need to decide whether we can stay on that course. I'm not saying we have to stay on it. We just, if we've got good reason to say we need a little bit more time to get this thing right, and I think that's, you know, that may wind up being the case. The most important thing is to get it right.
Yeah, but that may be something that we have to bring to that steering committee as well, to say, especially because we got feedback on this outreach, it does warrant, you know, taking the time to to do that well. And if they recognize that, you know, people do care because they came, like I'm going to say again at the end of this, I'm surprised how many comments were submitted on such a range of topics. And, you know, the fact that it overlaps with this bridge crossing, I think, you know, how to keep the effort sort of neatly in its little box is not possible because of all the things it overlaps with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think playing into it a little bit too, and I know that the phase 3 has always sort of been out there as, oh, that's the next step. We don't exactly know what that is. But in light of the budget and where we are in this environment, we may not get to any phase.
Yeah.
So if this group needs to do a little bit more depth of analysis and specificity in planning to get things honed in the way we really want it, I think that's another thing we need to think through, because I don't think there's going to be money for a few years to do much of any phase 3 work. So if something needs a little bit more vetting, it's probably worth taking the time now to do as much as we can to. So I know I'm pushing the clock, but I'm not assuming we have to stay on it. Just trying to stay on it till we can.
I would say from our perspective, I mean, we kind of want to be respectful of the constraints that we were given. I don't think we plan to have an adopted plan by the end of this year. We plan to be able to have something that resembled a final draft. I think what we are sort of planning on doing is we're just going to assume that we're going to work with the information we have and keep moving forward, and then constantly be reevaluating what else do we need, what else would be helpful, you know, just kind of going back, like, what do we have, what else do we need, and so that we have something that we can move towards a product that at least is in the stages of being able to be revised versus trying to create a final product at the very end. It's sort of how we're approaching it, if that makes sense.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I agree. I mean, we don't want to move a plan forward if we know that there's like a huge gap that we haven't figured out yet, or if there are like major stakeholders that we know are going to be impacted, but we don't have that feedback from. We don't want to create a plan that's going to fail because we were in a rush to meet an arbitrary deadline.
Well, there's a contract and a deliverable too. We have to think about that, and who's working on. You're going to deliver us a draft. We need to decide whether that's something that goes back to you to complete in a better way, or is it delivered and the city and the county work on it from there on. Those are the decisions that we have to make too, and that plays into your timeline versus our timeline and whether they're the same or different.
Sure.
Before I go, I just wanted to say one thing to Jessica. I'm sorry to feel, I don't mean to be sticking my nose into the bridge project so much, but because the bridge project and the communications was thought to start out or to be part of this Rivanna corridor study, there are just folks in the county they're watching that bridge project quite a bit. We want to make sure that it gets presented and in the proper context, and we don't have some issues that we've had with some other projects. I don't think they're the same type of projects at the same stage, but that's why the communication is real important. So I apologize for sticking my nose into where maybe I wasn't really part of that plan. I'm just trying to make sure everyone's aware of how we're moving forward with it. So sorry to be a
No, I just wanted to say no need to apologize. If you don't know, I'm relatively new to the Charlottesville area, so I feel like, you know, having the context that, you know, sitting in on these meetings provides and that you all can provide is it's really helpful. So actually, I appreciate it, David. So no need to apologize.
We'd also rather get like some slightly uncomfortable like questions asked from you all versus getting reamed over the coals publicly. You know, that's always preferable.
Well, good.
Sometimes you get lucky and you get both though, right? So
yeah, right. All right. I've got a 1:30. I've got her.
All right. Thank Thanks, everyone. I don't think I have anything else, but Crystal, maybe I'll just put together a summary for people to look at. Like I'll send out the same thing with our notes, and just at least if nothing else, they have that to give some thought to. Maybe for right now. Do you think that would work for now?
Yeah, and maybe give them a deadline for people to provide you some sort of either acknowledgement that they've read it or feedback, because I think that's the problem, is that we're all like, even just today, right, in this meeting, there's 50 new emails that come in, and unfortunately, this doesn't seem like anything's exploding, right? And so it becomes easy to just put it off to the side, and yet it's important. And so how to keep the rest of our colleagues looped in is just helpful.
Sure. All right. Well, I'll send something out at least, and I don't know that I can guarantee that they read it, but
No, you can't, but
we'll do our best to keep it in front of them.
thank you, Sandy. You guys have been doing a good job helping push this forward. And the two presentations, I did listen to pieces of both of them. It was very well done. I mean, I think you guys pulled off a pretty smooth public meeting. So obviously you practiced the handoff thing, so that worked well.
You never really know what you're going to expect or what you're going to get when you go into those. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Bye.
Bye.